Hello, I'm Shannon Tiezi with the Diplomat, and I'm here today at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., where I'm very happy to be sitting down with Michael Swaine, who's a senior associate in the Asia program here at Carnegie. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
You're welcome.
We're going to be talking today about Xi Jinping's visit to the United States and, more importantly, what's next for U.S. China relations now that the visit has been concluded. So, Michael, to start off, what did you think of the visit? How did it go? What were the major accomplishments, and what didn't quite go as well as could have?
Well, I thought the summit went really well, all things considered, and particularly considering the climate that was in evidence, at least in Washington, in the lead up to the summit. I think it's important to have these kinds of meetings, and this one was particularly important to set a certain tone for the relationship, which I think was in fact done. It was done both in the remarks of President Xi and President Obama. It was done in the remarks of some of the senior officials, particularly Susan Rice in her remarks at George Washington University just before the summit. They made it clear that the relationship is an important one, that the two countries need to work together and cooperate in a whole range of areas despite their differences, and that this was something that both governments were committed to doing. And that's an important message to send. Now, in terms of the specifics, it was kind of a mixed bag. There were some promising signs on certain fronts. The areas that I follow more closely are the security-related ones. There was more forthcomingness, I guess I should say, of the Chinese side on the cyber issue. Xi Jinping recognized that commercial espionage is an issue. He expressed the desire to cooperate with the United States in investigating these issues, so he took it seriously. I mean, this was signaled before the summit when they sent over their top individual in charge of cybersecurity related issues to meet with U.S. officials and talk about this issue, in part because the Chinese wanted to avoid sanctions on Chinese corporations and other entities over cyber issues, but also because I think they have understood that this issue is really important for the United States and they need to engage with the U.S. Mm-hmm. So in addition to the statements, they've also agreed to set up a working group or dialogue of sorts where they can periodically and regularly look at the problem and review it, exchange views on it. And also, I think they're hoping to move towards a more steady process of conducting investigations where the two sides will exchange information about certain violations that they've seen or concerns that they have. There's also, I think, a desire to try and move towards an agreement about not targeting certain types of infrastructure in peacetime. That's a possibility as well. So that's all positive in terms of the general statements and some of the structures, but of course the follow-through is going to be critical here, and the United States has already said that very clearly. There has to be clear follow-through, that they feel that the Chinese position is not simply to deny everything in terms of Chinese government involvement in this. And we'll just see. I mean, the U.S. side will have to come forth, I think, with some very convincing evidence in some cases about violations, and the Chinese side will be required to respond now that Xi Jinping has weighed in on this in a very direct way. So, that's a promising start in that area. You also saw some promising developments on the mill side, where the United States and China have agreed to add an air safety annex to their existing agreement about encounters, to be able to strengthen or avoid the possibility of incidents in air-to-air. They've also started talking about developing encounters issues to do with the Coast Guard, not just the military, because Chinese Coast Guard is really the major entity that's involved in a lot of the maritime disputes in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And the United States obviously has assets out there working as well, naval assets. So getting the Coast Guard on the Chinese side involved in this is a really important thing to do. So that's also good. And then there's also been a further agreement on communications, crisis communications in particular, that gets certain commitments about communicating with the other side and communicating through certain channels in the event of a crisis. So all that is also for the good. There were also some positive statements made about the national security law issue, which is of great concern to U.S. corporations involved in China. They're concerned that the Chinese are going to start invoking various laws or regulations that will really inhibit the ability of U.S. companies to operate in China, and will indeed leave them open to they'll have to give up their secrets or technology or their privileged information to the Chinese because of desires on the Chinese side to maintain access to some of the, particularly in the technology area. Xi Jinping was to some degree reassuring about this. He said that the foreign entities operating in China will operate on the same playing field, in effect, be treated equally to Chinese companies. Of course, that could be troublesome because Chinese companies could also be subject to a lot of very intrusive regulations. And then, of course, he said that companies are expected to observe Chinese laws. So again, we have to see exactly what this turns out to be in the long term. An area where I'd like to have seen more discussion, more concrete results would be in the South China Sea and the disputes that are going on there. Xi Jinping made some positive statements about no intention of militarizing the South China Sea, but of course, to some degree, it's already been militarized. All the partners, to some degree, have military-related personnel or facilities on these islands, all the disputants, rather. And the Chinese side committing itself to not going to further militarization, which I hope was the intent of Xi Jinping's statement, is something that now the United States needs to follow up on. And I hope there'll be discussions that will talk more specifically about the kinds of developments on the Chinese side that would be particularly worrisome for the United States, and in return that the United States would also be more forthcoming and clear about what its intentions are and what it might do vis-a-vis Chinese behavior in certain areas. I think there needs to be a clear understanding on the part of both the United States and China about certain things that they will or won't do regarding activities and facilities, etc., in the South China Sea. And we didn't see any of that sort of discussion, I don't think, at the summit. So I hope that they will embark on this in the aftermath of it, given Xi Jinping's statements.
Mm-hmm. So the general theme is there was a lot of promises, a lot of talk, but we need to see the concrete action that's going to come. So returning to the question of cyber issues, I don't think anyone thinks this problem is solved simply because China has promised not to engage in cyber commercial espionage anymore. So what realistically do you think is the sort of progress we're actually going to see in a best case scenario over the next few months?
Well, over the next few months, realistically, I think they'll set up this framework, this discussion for exchanging views on this. I think they'll try and define exactly, I hope they will define what is commercial espionage in the cyber area. The Chinese have raised this issue, saying, how do you make the distinction between national security, cyber espionage, which the United States admits everybody conducts, and espionage aimed at commercial entities to extract information. And if they can clearly define this, and I think they will push for doing this, and that is a possibility that they could do that and make that more clearly defined, then they can use that as a basis for saying, okay, we've seen a certain type of violation here, and here's the evidence for it. What is the position on the Chinese side for this in response to this? And so bringing forth the substance of exactly what it is you're concerned about and what it is that the evidence might indicate, I think is a realistic set of steps in the future. Now, if the Chinese government says all of the evidence you're giving us is circumstantial or it's inconclusive, it really doesn't establish any kind of trail to any parts of the Chinese government involved in this, then of course you'll have continued wrangling about that issue. And if the United States cannot provide convincing information on this, then of course there'll be a continued dragging of this issue, and I'm not sure there will be much resolution of it. But you may see a decrease in the amount of violations, cyber attacks and such, on commercial entities as a result of this process. Even though the Chinese don't necessarily respond to a particular charge or violation or set of evidence, you may still see a reduction in the amount of attacks, and that's important. So we'll see if that happens.
And I think on the military to military front, the agreements that you mentioned were a bit overshadowed by the other announcements that were made. So how important is it that the U.S. and China now have this annex on air-to-air encounters between their militaries?
Well, it's critically important. It's going to be the case over the next years, decades, that China is going to be a much more active military and paramilitary participant presence in the Western Pacific. And the United States has historically been the dominant maritime power in that part of the world. That is, in my view, changing. And so as you have more and more Chinese activities in this area, and because you have differences over significant issues, from Taiwan to these maritime disputes of one sort or another, the role of U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance activities along the Chinese coast where the U.S. and China differ, all of these issues could provoke serious incidents in the future of one sort or another, and it's very important to have rules of the road for the operators on the ground as they interact with each other in these areas, so that you don't have unforeseen or unintended incidents that could then escalate in a very serious way between the two countries. So it's not a panacea, it's not an absolute solution to the issue, which is a much broader question of balance of power in the Western Pacific, but it does address the issue of incidents and unintended incidents and establish a frame of reference, a protocol for the two militaries and coast guards to interact in that very sensitive area.
So Xi Jinping's visit is over, and we saw a lot of agreements made, but it also has removed the pressure that both sides felt to keep the relationship stable before this state visit by the Chinese president. So with that in mind, what's your forecast for U.S.-China relations moving forward?
Well, my forecast is that I think in the short to medium term, it's going to be manageable. It's going to be, these issues are people are going to have now a more practical, pragmatic approach, I think, in looking at exactly what we can do to address some of these deeper concerns. At the same time, I think there's been such a reaffirmation of the importance of cooperation between the two countries that I think that will affect and strengthen the commitment on both sides to work together on these issues. So I don't foresee any major incidents occurring in the near to medium term in this relationship unless you have some kind of action through misinterpretation of one sort or another, either in the South China Sea or someplace else, that escalates the situation, or you have another major cyber attack of one sort or another that is perceived to be originating from the Chinese government. I think in the aftermath of this summit, the chances of that happening are less likely. But even if they do, I think that the relationship is certainly on a sounder footing than it was before the summit, and that there'll be a better capability, I think, to deal with these kinds of problems going forward. Now, longer term, I think the relationship still faces some very serious issues that relate to what I said earlier, which has to do with the changing balance of power in the Western Pacific, the presence of the two respective militaries and their allies in the U.S. case, and how they will work out their relationship over the longer term. And I think that's going to be a big challenge, but it's certainly not a near to medium term challenge.
Well, thank you so much, Michael.
You're welcome.
Good overview of U.S.-China relations. And we'll all be following this along. Once again, I'm Shannon Chiesi at the Diplomat.